the panel is about the cloud platforms for cloud providers, which is a very interesting concept and very interesting topic that has been nicely introduced by Mr. Maes. Mr. Maes, I don't think that we need to further introduce yourself or your company. You think you've been very eloquent. On the other hand, Mr. Arnold, would you care to say a little bit about yourself and your company?
Yes, of course. Hello and welcome. My name is Marc Arnold. I'm responsible for the product marketing at Infopark, a cloud solution vendor from Berlin in Germany. So Infopark has developed and delivered an on-premise enterprise content management system over 15 years ago. But you know, modern websites are more interactive applications, and this has nothing to do with developing static documents or presenting static documents. So we started 3 years ago on scratch to develop a totally new web service, cloud service for our customers, and it's based on, like you presented before, on the infrastructure. We use Amazon Web Services for infrastructure, and on top we have our Elastic Web Platform, the web application environment for build and run your website, and on top we offer our software as a service, like a content management system and customer relationship management system.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Da Silva, you are the Director of Channel and Alliances from Interoute.
Yes.
Would you like to push the red button and... Yes?
I don't see any red button, but yes, probably this one. Okay.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. As said, leading the channel alliance within Interoute. So what we're trying to do is actually build a whole new channel within Interoute. So Interoute comes from the ground. As you just heard Citrix speaking about software, we changed our cloud vision by starting from the network. So we build a public and private cloud capability with our virtual data center. And that's what we're trying to do. So from the network perspective, we build different zones. We have different data center capability in Europe. We have virtual data zones now working in UK, in Berlin, in Switzerland, France, and Netherlands, and we give that capability as infrastructure as a service, as we call it, to our partners, and if customer wants for hybrid solutions for any burst capability. So that's what we do.
Okay, thank you. So we have a panel complete. Is there any question for panel from the audience? Please raise your hand. Don't be shy. Yes, thank you. You can have mine.
Thank you. Regarding the hosting services, how do you see the future of competition? Do you fear that there will be such competition that it will commoditize, or can players differentiate themselves?
Can I answer that one? It's quite an interesting one. So the perspective of the networks, and actually 10 years ago, when Interoute started the company, we had the same question from the networking side. A lot of companies wanted to build their own networks. So we saw a lot of partnerships growing, a lot of companies building their own networks. And actually after 10 years that came to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 big providers. From my vision, I think that will be the same in 5 to 10 years from a cloud perspective. So there will only be the big ones surviving and having the scale to survive that. But that's my personal opinion.
Yeah, I think there's a big chance of commoditization. But I think the most important is to make sure that as a hosting provider, you understand who are your customers. If you take the example of GoDaddy, GoDaddy is the biggest hosting provider in the world. And last week they announced they will discontinue their cloud service offering. Right, which, by the way, they were one of my references in the slide. But as you can see, the fact that they had an offering in the market for the wrong segment, right? If they address SMBs or consumers, that offering is not interesting for them. On the other spectrum, if you take British Telecom, who is offering global virtual data center services, but with applications, they have a verticalized approach. And I think for big players that are in the managed cloud environment, They will come with a pharmaceutical cloud. They'll come with a, I think the gentleman from Logica had a very good example in the oil and industry. These are community clouds which are managed by the managed service provider based on an elastic infrastructure, and I think that's where you can continue to have premium. If you take another example in Germany, a government cloud, that project we did, they will present tomorrow. That is a very good use case whereby municipalities are customers of a cloud service provider. And again, it is based on specific knowledge of the customer, specific knowledge of the requirements. It doesn't actually mean that you have to have an extremely sophisticated infrastructure all the time, but ultimately it's about the business process or the applications that go on top of that. That's how you can avoid commoditization, just like in any other industry. You know, if you don't have any value add or knowledge about what the end user specific requirements are in a certain industry, it's tough to keep your value add margin.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes?
Yeah, I can probably do without the mic. Just a question around service level agreements. So we use a lot of cloud, platform as a service, and most specifically AWS. We've had a look at quite a few different offerings, and SLAs are really one of the areas where cloud platform providers tend to differ a fair bit. And you mentioned yourself in your talk around designing for failure, and the fact is that potentially your service providers sort of handing off a lot of responsibility to their customers? It's a sort of admission that, look, these things are going to fail. It's up to you to make sure that you keep them up.
I think it's a great question. I think for some service providers, it's exactly the message. If you take Amazon Web Services, that's exactly what they say, right? If you read their terms and conditions, they say that in 99.9% of the probability, there will always be one availability zone up and running. But when you contract with Amazon Web Services, you contract for all of their availability zones. Implicitly mentions that, well, you can have 9 availability zones failing, and I will still hit my SLA. And so you, Mr. Developer, make sure that your application is resilient and can cope with failure in the hardware. So I think that is a certain market, and it's a big market, right? Because a lot of new applications are built that way, and it's shifting the responsibility to the developers and to the customer. On the other spectrum, and I think it's very applicable maybe here in Luxembourg, whereby big SLAs, if some of the providers outside here, they advertise with tier 4 data centers with lots of SLA, lots of service, whereby they take the full responsibility of managing that SLA and do not want to shift that back to the customer because the customer is not open for that. They will pay a premium for that, but they'll be happy with that. So I think there's actually a market for both extremes, and it's just about which is your customer and what is their expectation. So come back to the 2 types of workloads. Not all of the workloads are cloud enabled and can deal with failure. You cannot just simply say you're in the cloud and then take my SLA and that's it. That's my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Oh, that's good because I got a few of my own. Actually, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that some of the providers are going out of business. It kind of raises the question, how important are open standards and the fact that you can move from one provider to the other, or open source in general for cloud computing? There's been a lot of talk about OpenStack or versus Cloud Stack. Do you have any comment on that? Any one of you?
You guys want to give it a shot?
Yes, I think open source is very important, so we also use it. So like you said in your presentation before, open source is maybe boosting the cloud industry, and I think it's very important, yes.
I think it goes hand in hand with the whole openness and the fact that, and I think most of the vendors now have open APIs so that you can actually take a piece of technology, embed it into another piece of technology that you might already have. And I think open source does not necessarily go hand in hand with portability, right? Because actually not at all. I think you still can have a good vendor lock-in based on an open source technology, right? There's enough big brands in there that have announced public clouds based on an open source technology, but it's still a public cloud from brand XYZ. I think the most interesting piece is that open source drive innovation by your customers, right? So when we move to Apache, suddenly we have 800 developers working on the product, in making it better. Then there's releases, and you release actually a product which is much better than if you would develop it yourself. So that's, I think, one big thing. And the other thing is that because it's open, you can have new startups innovating. Software-defined network is very much these three names on my slide: Nasira, Midokura, and Big Switch. I don't know how many people are in these companies, but there are not many, right? They're less than 100. But they come up with a technology that is the innovation that is needed into that field. And because they can build these technologies, just like your company, you're building on someone else's technology, right? You have a value add, and you need something that allows you access into that technology. If it's not open source or there's no open API and it's a closed stack, how can you build a value add on top of something else? And it's kind of a Lego puzzle that you build by opening up your technology to other ecosystem partners. And I think that's the biggest value. And I hope that that ecosystem of partners will drive a lot of innovation in the IT industry, whereby smart young people are inventing new technology that solves the problem, and then they'll be acquired ultimately by a big company, but that innovation is possible because of openness.
Bright vision of the future. Thank you. You speak about Lego. You speak about pieces that you can put together. What about the famous cloud broker role? Do you think that there is a future for that, or anyone? It doesn't have to be you.
Nelson, go on.
Yeah. The cloud. Well, I think the open standards question is, of course, how open standards do we have, and does it work with the whole cloud openness, of course. So if the open standards are there, I'm a big believer of having that. But it depends also on how the go-to-market is of a channel or a system in an ISV. Yeah, I hope if we have the open standards and everything works as it should work, that we can have the interoperability between that. And I think the cloud brokerage is probably a whole new shift of within the IT, which we will see the coming years. But it's something new. I don't know how it will look like, but definitely if we get it working, then we will have something new coming up in the cloud computing world.
I think it's early days, but you already start seeing it. So I think the telecom operators, the incumbents, are really interested in playing that role. So a lot of the requests we're getting is, can you give me something where I can just resell all the cloud services that might be available? Some of my own, some third party, and I just want to make sure that I can invoice my customer at the end of the month with everything they've consumed, right? Well, networking services. And service providers are in need for these type of services because in general, revenue is not greatly increasing, right? There's lots of restructuring, and they're losing revenue to other competitors. And I think that role would be a great role of the service provider. And we're starting to see early signs that some service providers are going into that direction. Will ultimately the customers buy from an incumbent telecom operators all of their cloud services? We have yet to see, right? Because the beauty with cloud is that you can go straight to the technology provider, right? You go straight to Skype, you go straight to all of these SaaS applications. Why do you need the middleman? What's the role of the distributor in that world? Right? We see distributors that are launching platforms for cloud aggregation and cloud brokerage, but I think that's might be a temporary move, and then at some point customers are intelligent enough to choose the puzzles themselves. But I don't know exactly how it's going to pan out, but I think it's an interesting discussion. But the interest is there, yes, and it can happen. Technology-wise, it's possible already.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
A lot of the conversation has been based around, if you like, looking forwards and moving workloads into cloud and having the cloud providers satisfying that demand. What workloads do you think are least likely to migrate to cloud providers, and how do you think, as a panel, the IT department will look in the future? If you like, the legacy IT department.
That's a heavy question. I don't know. But I can see the work. I probably can answer by seeing which workloads are moving already, right? And then it's very clear that I would say almost non-business critical applications. You know, if you take a layer of abstraction, these are the ones that are moving right now. So I would say in the enterprise space, probably 90% of our projects are test and dev. So in the financial sector, insurance sector, they have thousands of developers. These developers need environments, so they'll build a private cloud for these guys. And that private environment might be on a KVM, Zen server farm, so it doesn't have to be as expensive as their vBlock or FlexPod that they have, which they will keep for their business critical application, right? Same with an airport that we're doing a project. So I think that's the segregation. I think how it will move depends really on the evolution of the legacy applications and the refresh cycles. And if you do a refresh for SAP and SAP is cloud enabled, well, then maybe you will move SAP ultimately to that cloud infrastructure. But right now, my experience is that enterprises are very prudent, and they're starting with the safe piece. So you know, it doesn't hurt actually if your test and dev cloud is out for half an hour. It's not really critical. I mean, you'll have not so happy internal customers, but it doesn't actually disrupt your business too much. The IT department will probably be, I think it will be a mix between being able to understand the technology and manage it yourself, and be able to manage a number of cloud providers, probably. Maybe an SLA manager somehow.
Is that an answer to your question? Okay, thank you. Any further question? So, final question for our panel, and then we will have catch up with our time lag. We briefly touched the role of a cloud broker. What cloud services, which cloud services do you think will be offered by service providers in the next, let's say, 6-9 months on the market?
I think, well, it comes actually to the same direction. I think it depends on how you want to look at it from a corporate perspective, from an indirect perspective. So I'm more from a channel perspective. So coming back again to the question which we had, how it will shift. I think from a channel perspective, it's quite important to, when you go into a cloud or work with a cloud partner or a cloud broker or whatever, it's very important that you at least have the capability of building hybrid solutions. And so from a service provider, I think you need to be able to offer those hybrid, because we're still not there, and there's no company out there which will move all of his on-prem in the cloud at once. So from my perspective, that will be, from a service provider, you need to have that capability, and especially also the capability of having a environment to work like that. So offering hybrid and work together to offer any cloud services or advisory or consultancy, and at least capable of building hybrid solutions.
Thank you.
I would say probably big data is the next big thing, so storage as a service. So service providers are interested in having a way to become a storage as a service provider, so that because I think it's a fairly lucrative market, but that requires that there is a piece of infrastructure required that allow to scale, you know, for that data storage at a much larger scale than today, and probably database as a service goes hand in hand with that. And I think platform as a service, there's a lot of talks about it, but I don't really see a lot of traction. I think the PaaS area is still in its infancy. It is also on top of the agenda, but I think for a service provider, these are the ones which he actually has together with network as a service. So these are infrastructure that the service provider actually has. These are the assets, reselling Office 365 or Link. I'm not sure if you're a service provider, if that's a very viable long-term revenue generator, right? You don't really have any of that asset. You'll probably put it into your portfolio because customers might want that. But ultimately, you know, your assets are the network, the storage network, the compute, the BSS or SS layer. So these are the things that you can actually, you know, it's like a utility manufacturing. You have your electricity factories, and that's where you can actually generate revenue on. So I see these as immediate 6 to 9 months, the ones that we will start to see on the market with the big service providers.
Okay. Thank you for those insights. And on behalf of Eurocloud, I would like to thank the panel for these interesting views. So.